Villains don't typically win the day when going up against Spider-Man, and sometimes their defeats can even be borderline embarrassing. Sometimes they can be full-on embarrassing. Not only does Spider-Man have superpowers at his disposal, but he's also a quick-witted guy who has an endless supply of quips to tease you if you happen to get badly defeated. Number 10. First appearance, first defeat. During his very first appearance, Vulture ended up being defeated. He first appeared in The Amazing Spider-Man issue number 2, and ended that first story he appeared in during the first half of the comic, of course, in prison. Vulture here manages to catch Spider-Man unawares the first time they meet, and even kinda captures him. However, Spider-Man escapes and later outsmarts Vulture, realizing that he relies on his wing gadgetry to soar and really has no powers of his own and is just kind of an old guy. Spider-Man creates a device which disables Vulture's wings. Next time the two encounter one another, he uses it during the fight and handily defeats Vulture just like that, clipping the old man's wings and leaving that bird to be caged. Sorry, Adrian. Number 9. Spotter needed. When it comes to Miles Morales' first trip out as Spider-Man, it was embarrassing for both Miles and the first villain he encountered on patrol, Kangaroo. Miles was wearing a Spider-Man costume after Spider-Man, aka Peter Parker, had died, and a lot of onlookers felt that this costume was in bad taste because of this. Miles also struggled somewhat with this instigation. He was just kind of getting the hang of his powers. But he got the final punch in his fight against Kangaroo, who had hoisted a car over his head and was about to throw it at Miles. Miles' punch to Kangaroo's chest causes him to drop the car on his own head, making him kinda knock himself out. How embarrassing. Don't worry, Miles does kick him away to safety, so at least he doesn't get crushed by that car. You should always be careful when lifting heavy objects, case in point. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you love when villains get embarrassed, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 8. Inferior Superior. One of the most embarrassing defeats for Otto Octavius around has to be when Spider-Man's heroism and Otto's kinda lack thereof made him realize that despite being called Superior Spider-Man, Otto, who was in Peter Parker's body at the time, was not actually capable of saving the day here. He needed Peter's help. This caused Otto to relinquish the body he stole back to Peter Parker, who still had a remaining consciousness left within it. Surrendering, Otto would later show back up in a clone of Peter's body, but would eventually go back to being the regular old Doc Ock in the end. Stick to what you're best at, maybe, is the moral here. Although I won't lie, I did enjoy watching Superior Spider-Man thwip around the city, beating baddies in Spider-Man's place. There were some things he was pretty good at, but this just wasn't one of them. It was a neat time in the comics. Number 7. Rejected. We've seen this tactic used a few times to beat Venom. Initially, Spider-Man was the one whom the Venom symbiote wanted the most. Spider-Man was initially depicted as the first host, and has been the symbiote's first host in a few different versions of the tale. Although in the comics, Venom now has like a whole back history like before Spider-Man, so yeah. That is a thing that happened. In the Spectacular Spider-Man animated show, the fact that Peter is the first host remains to be the true narrative, as well as in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, or the Raimiverse as well actually. In the Spectacular Spider-Man animated show, it's this connection to Spider-Man that Peter uses in order to defeat the symbiote. He creates a rift between Eddie and the Venom symbiote by offering himself to be the symbiote's host, suggesting that the Venom symbiote, never really wanted to be with Eddie, and that he was basically kinda like a rebound for them. When the Venom symbiote decides to leave Eddie, this is seemingly confirmed, hurting their relationship. After bonding to Peter, they also learn that Peter was lying and didn't actually want to be with them. And while trying to make Peter be their one and only, he ends up being protected by the memories and mental manifestations of those he loves within his consciousness. You can't make someone love you. Sorry, Venom. You can try, but it's not gonna work. Number 6. Surprise Spider-Man. Surprise! It's Spider-Man! In Superior Spider-Man issue number 31, we get to see Spider-Man embarrass Green Goblin when his return surprises him. You see, Norman thinks that Spider-Man is actually Superior Spider-Man, aka Otto Octavius, but Spider-Man reveals that it's not Otto driving this time around, and that Peter Parker is truly Spider-Man once more. And of course, you know what that means. Green Goblin is going down, and Spider-Man is going to make fun of his man purse while he does it. Of course, Peter himself himself is also surprised to find Norman has changed his face, but this doesn't prevent him from kicking Green Goblin's butt, helping to free Otto's love, Anna Maria, and save the day. Number 5. A not so shocking defeat. Of course, Shocker is generally considered to be a B or even C list Spider-Man villain, and as a result he gets made fun of a lot in the comics normally. But it's somehow even more embarrassing in the Ultimate Universe. In issue number 8 of Ultimate Spider-Man, the issue opens with Spider-Man taking on Shocker and making embarrassingly quick work of him, asking who exactly he's supposed to be, the vibrator? Because yeah, the shock he's emitting is pretty weak. The other hilarious point here is that Spider-Man then turns the shock back on the Shocker, jamming his guns and basically causing him to shock himself. Ouch. Number 4. Watch your step. This embarrassing defeat comes to us from the pages of issue 230 of the Amazing Spider-Man comic. In this two-part story, Spider-Man took on the unstoppable power of the Juggernaut. While physically Peter struggled, Spider-Man eventually figured out a way to put a stop to Juggernaut without having to try and match his strength. Instead, he jumped on his head and he covered his eyes. Because they were fighting in a construction site, as Juggernaut flailed around trying to basically get the spider off his head, he accidentally stumbled into some wet cement, sinking down deep and finding himself trapped. So apparently take Juggernaut's eyesight away and he'll basically defeat himself because he's so clumsy. At least that's how it went down this time. Spider-Man of course just leapt to safety after Juggernaut was confirmed as stuck, taking the opportunity to make fun of all of his clumsiness. Poor Juggernaut. Stumblefoot, I think that's what he calls him. You Stumblefoot. Number 3. Back in Black. During the events of the Back in Black storyline, Peter dons his old black costume while trying to hunt down the person responsible for shooting Aunt May. He ends up discovering that Kingpin was behind the hit. In truth, it had actually been a hit put on Peter Parker after it was revealed that he was Spider-Man, but Aunt May was shot instead by accident. As Aunt May lay in the hospital fighting for her life, Peter decided to pay Kingpin a visit in prison. Not caring about his identity any longer, he even removed the top half of his suit, wanting Kingpin to know that this is Peter Parker fighting him, not Spider-Man. Peter brutally beats Kingpin up, humiliating him in front of the other inmates. The whole point is to show Kingpin just how strong Peter is and how he could easily kill Fisk, should he want to. He leaves Kingpin just barely alive to live with the humiliation of what happened, but does warn if Aunt May dies, then he'll be back to finish the job. Considering Fisk is all about being the strongest, most powerful guy in the room, this whole fight would be pretty embarrassing for him. Number 2. Hubris. A lot of Spider-Man's villains carry a certain kind of pride around when it comes to taking on Spidey. They often see themselves as better than Spider-Man, which is how they know they are sure to win. They also often see themselves as better than each other as well. And yet, often they don't end up winning. One of the most embarrassing and smartest defeats occurred when one of Spider-Man's most iconic villains had his ego used against him. Yep, we're talking about Norman Osborn. At this point in time, Norman was actually also bonded to the Carnage symbiote, turning him into the villain that we would refer to as Red Goblin. Well, together these two seemed pretty unstoppable. Armed with both the Goblin's serum powers and Carnage's power set, Spider-Man managed to defeat Osborn by getting him to ditch the symbiote. Got in his head. And all it took was taunting Norman to do this, implying that a victory while bonded to the Carnage symbiote would be more a victory for the symbiote than Norman himself, and implying that Osborn couldn't beat Spider-Man alone. This prompted Norman to ditch Carnage, which of course resulted in him being defeated by Spider-Man and company. But really, Spider-Man. Number 1. Defeated by laughter. And of course this list would not be complete if we did not mention one of the most embarrassing defeats of all time, and just in general, most embarrassing villains. Aw, sorry Peter. Paste Pot Pete. This one went down during the Spider-Man Human Torch team-up series in issue number 1. Here Paste Pot Pete is attempting to get revenge on the Human Torch, aka Johnny Storm, when he runs into Spider-Man. Spider-Man doesn't even fight this poor guy, he just defeats him by embarrassing him. When Peter Petruski reveals his intent and his villainous name of Paste Pot Pete, Spider-Man reacts not by attacking him, but by falling to the ground, laughing at the idea of his ridiculous villain name. Paste Pot Pete ends up just walking away, deciding he should probably change his name. Later on, he would become Trapster, which is a lot better, but still not great in terms of villain names that, you know, aren't ridiculous in some way. What do you think are some of the most embarrassing defeats among Spider-Man's villains? Which villain do you think is the most embarrassing in general? Which do you think are basically bulletproof when it comes to embarrassment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This has been Top 10 Nerd, and I'm your host Amanda McKnight. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, you stay nerdy, YouTube.